Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents and U.S. history, and I discuss the American legal system. I'm continuing with my discussion in honor of Black History Month, and this is the second part of the anti-Semitic lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish man in Atlanta, Georgia, which occurred in 1915. Before I give um, the statement of facts, the entire story from the beginning, I think it's very important that I just describe the cast of characters and the the atmosphere in in Atlanta, Georgia, where the murder of Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old white worker, where Leo Frank had been a manager at the National Pencil Factory. So, of course, again, there was the lynching of Leo Frank had the uh, intersection of racism, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, and of course classism, and of course politics in Atlanta, Georgia. So, very important characters. I'm going to discuss Leo Frank last, right? But let me start with the prosecutor. The prosecutor's name was Hugh Dorsey, right? He was a young man, and interestingly, um, back then in Atlanta, Georgia, this, the murder, of course, occurred April 26, uh, 1913. April 26, 1913. Interestingly, that day was the Confederacy Day, right? Confederacy Day. The victim, Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old white girl who worked at the factory, was getting ready to go for the Confederate Days parade right after she collected her paycheck, right? A meager paycheck from um, uh, the manager of the National Pencil Factory. That's Leo Frank, the Jewish manager. So Hugh Dorsey was the prosecutor. Back then, the prosecutor was also a was the investigator. So he was the investigator of the crime, and he was a prosecutor as well. Hugh Dorsey, interestingly, later on, he would go on to become governor of Georgia, right? He became a two-term governor of Georgia, a Democratic governor. Now, of course, there was conflict between the Democrats, which was a populist party at the time, and the Republicans. Republicans were considered, Republicans, remember at that time, 1913, that was a party of advocating for black civil rights, black equality with the South. That was a party of Lincoln. That was a party that black people identified with. Um, so Hugh Dorsey was the prosecutor. He was a Democrat and he was anti carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers was a derogatory term that was used in the South at that time for white Northerners, right? Northerners who came from New York and moved south with their money and influence, trying to obtain equal rights, civil rights for Black Americans, right? And trying to just dominate uh, white Southerners. That's how white Southern Democrats represented, these carpetbaggers. So they were the most hated group in the agrarian South at the time. So, um, in fact, uh, Hugh Dorsey, who was a Democrat, a populist Democrat, had referred to Leo Frank as a carpetbagger, right? Even though there was no evidence that Leo Frank was actively involved in politics. I'm going to describe him later on, right? There was no evidence that he was actively involved in politics, in partisan politics whatsoever. But the Southern white Democrats in the agrarian South, in agrarian Georgia at the time, which was still very poor, and there was the gradual infusion of industrialization from the north. Their enemies were the carpetbaggers, and the prosecutor Hugh Dorsey hated these carpetbaggers, and he described Leo Frank as a carpetbagger. Right? Again, carpetbaggers. They came from the north. They were rich. They brought their industrialization. They wanted to dominate white southern, Southern Democrats, and they were, to the white Southerners, they were normally inciting blacks against. They were viewed as inciting blacks against white supremacy in the South, right? So, this was the description of carpetbaggers, and they were mainly Republicans, right? They were mainly Republicans, and the South was still fuming, even though it had been many years after the Civil War. Reconstruction had ended in 1877, and there was a rise of the KKK. By the way, the KKK was dead with the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, passed under President Ulysses Grant. It was dead. But interestingly, this case, the case of Leo Frank, would be what would reignite and resurrect, the Ku Klux Klan. It would precipitate widespread recruitment of Klansmen in the South. So Hugh Dorsey, he was a very ambitious prosecutor. He would go on to win 2 terms as governor, and interestingly, he was against black lynching. The South, Atlanta, Georgia, apparently over the past decade had experienced race riots, and it had the highest crime rate of any city in America. At that time. So in fact, that place, Atlanta, there had been numerous unsolved murders, right? Numerous unsolved killings. But this particular instance, the thing is that a Jewish man was framed with the murder because the crime scene was in his factory, and so this was what made the difference. And it was a wealthy Jewish man from the north, from New York, that college educated, Ivy League. Like I said earlier in an earlier video, he graduated from Cornell University with a mechanical engineering degree. So he was a target of the ambitious Democrats who hated carpetbaggers. That's Hugh Dorsey. Hugh Dorsey's father had been a judge. And something else interesting about Hugh Dorsey is that, apart from his sentiments, later on when he was governor of Georgia, he would actually write um, a long screed, and I have it. I've read it. I will discuss it in a subsequent video, in which he sympathized with blacks. He actually indicted Georgians for their lynching of black people, for their, what do you call, the re-enslavement of blacks, and the abuses, the making them usual suspects, the way they demonized them. He actually compared the mistreatment of blacks in Georgia with the way King Leopold of Belgium had committed genocide in the Congo. He raised all these things in a strong indictment that Georgians had actually accused him of slander on Georgia. He went on, after he was a governor, to he lost his senatorial bid to someone who was with his ally at the time. That's Tom Watson. He lost that bid, but he went on to serve as a judge and circuit judge, the Atlantic circuit, on the Circuit in Georgia. He went on to serve as a judge later on. So he showed sympathies for black people because, again, he was a populist, and so he viewed blacks, as being victims of the rich, right? That they were impoverished victims of wealthy industrialists who were now, to him, invading the agrarian South, and exploiting labor. So this was a mindset set of Hugh Dorsey, right? Again, he sympathized with black people because of the lynchings. This was an era when there were mass lynchings in the South, right? And so he sympathized with black men. He knew the racism. He had spoken out against the racism of and exploitation of black people by whites, in the South. So you could see his mindset, but he hated the carpetbaggers, right? And he was also uh, well, I don't know if he was anti-Semitic as his ally, Tom Watson. So Tom Watson is another character, right? Tom Watson at the time, he was also a lawyer. He had actually been approached by Leo Frank's wealthy family, and he was given $5,000. That was a substantial amount. $5,000 is a lot of money now. He was offered $5,000 to lead the legal defense of Leo Frank, but Tom Watson turned it down. Tom Watson was a newspaper editor as well, in addition to being an attorney. He published the Jeffersonian. He was a populist. He he advocated for the collaboration, solidarity of poor Southern whites and blacks, right? Against, again, the wealthy elites. He hated the wealthy elites. Again, this was the wake of the Gilded Age. Southerners, poor white Southerners hated the wealthy industrialists, right, who were exploiting labor. This was a time when, um, there was this huge gap between the wealthy industrialists, especially from the North, and the poor laborers, the factory workers who worked without benefits. There were hazardous working conditions. The wages were a mere pittance and exploitation. There was child labor, and this was how the uh, the victim. That's Mary Fagan. She was a 13-year-old factory worker. So she represented the exploitation of the wealthy northern industrialists against, the against child labor, against the poor, especially poor whites. So Tom Watson was known at the time. He advocated for the solidarity of the poor. That's poor whites and poor blacks, and they should combine together against the wealthy industrial elites. Um, However, he would go on later on, right, to become uh, and he was an anti-Semite, right? His paper was a platform anti-Semitism, which we saw demonstrated in the Leo Frank case, and he would go on to direct his racism against blacks as well in general. But initially, he was very pro black. He was against lynching, but it is funny that it was he who would incite, during the Frank trials, right? He would incite the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan openly. And again, the case of the Leo Frank trial became an avenue for recruitment of the Ku Klux Klan again. So that's Thomas Watson. Um, and let me talk about the general environment, right? The general scene. This was 1913. The murder occurred in 1913, April 26th. The president was Woodrow Wilson. He was a white Southerner, even though he'd moved up north and became president of Princeton University, and he became governor of New Jersey. But he had, he's considered one of our most racist president, right? He was the one who, uh, in 1915, February 18, 1915, he would be the first president to screen a film in the White House, and the film he chose to screen was the birth of the nation, the racist birth of the nation, which at the time was called the Klansman. And what it did was it glorified the Ku Klux Klan. Um, I remember his reaction at the time when when he viewed the movie. The author of the novel, which the movie was based on, was a guy called Thomas Dixon, and he was actually Woodrow Wilson's friend. And the reaction of the president was that it was like writing history in lightning. That was his reaction, something of the sort. I paraphrase, but by his screening of the birth of the nation, which was called the Klansman at the time in the White House. It was the presidential endorsement of the Ku Klux Klan, right, and white supremacy. So this was 1915, February 18, 1915. That was when he screened, the Klansman, which was called, subsequently dubbed the birth of the nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan. And uh, in the White House, right? And so, of course, this was also the official endorsement and catalyst for the lost cause. Celebrating it gave a new, it prefigured the lost cause notion of the Confederates versus the North, right? And this was the beginning of recasting, reframing the Civil War, right? And the whole institution of slavery and Jim Crow in the South. So this was what was going on at that time, right? There was a lot of racism, there was anti-Semitism, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And I'm gonna talk about what happened. Now there was also a guy called Jim Conley. He was a Black American man, and he's the one who was a chief witness against Leo Frank. His damning testimony, he claimed, he confessed to having written two notes that were found by the victim's body, that's Mary Fagan's body, and it was intended to cast blame on another black man who found the body, right? He was a night watchman. His name was Newt Lee, and it was written by Jim Conley. Interestingly, Jim Conley would his testimony against Leo Frank, claiming that Leo Frank had directed him to write those notes in order to frame another man and to to mislead the police. He also claimed uh, that Leo Frank was the one who directed him to actually dispose of the body, right? So he should have. Eventually, historians have come to determine that the actual murderer was Jim Conley, the black man, and he was, he admitted to being drunk. He'd been inebriated. There could have been reasons. There were reasons why um, the populist Hugh Dorsey and Tom Watson, who were calling for the solidarity of poor blacks and poor whites, and who apparently blamed the poverty of Southerners on Northern industrialists, right? And who understood that if they had placed blame on the actual murderer, on Jim Conley, then they would be instigating, uh, something that they had spent their life's work against, that preventing lynching of black people, black men. And so they understood that if it were determined, if they ever spread any insinuation that the murderer was Jim Conley, he would be lynched, right? He would be lynched by the Southern whites. There would be no trial. He would just be lynched. So one thing that Hugh Dorsey did was he suppressed evidence, and when he was having Leo Frank indicted, he had him indicted of murder sometime May 24, in 1913, even though he had the testimony from um, Jim Conley that he was the one who wrote the scribbled notes to to mislead the police, but he claimed that he'd written it at the direction of Leo Frank, and he claimed that there was some other evidence that was discovered that clearly good prosecutors in modern times, they would immediately indict Jim Conley, right? He made a number of inconsistent statements, in his affidavits, right? He gave three affidavits that were inconsistent. They contradicted one another, and there was testimony that he was found washing washing off what appeared to be blood. So many other things. He was inebriated, but it was his damning testimony saying that he found Leo Frank with a rope, and that he confessed to having killed um, Mary Fagan, and he solicited the help of Jim Conley to dispose of the body. That he instructed Jim Conley to dispose of the body, and he promised to give him money, right, if he disposed of the body, which is very highly improbable when one considers it. So interestingly, there was also another the defense attorney um, for Leo Frank was a man called a very prominent lawyer in Georgia uh, by the name of Luther Rosser. Interestingly, Luther Rosser was actually the in-law of the prosecutor, Hugh Dorsey. So it's some kind of conflict of interest, because Hugh Dorsey's sister Sarah was married to Luther Rosser's son, Luther Rosser Jr. So they were in-laws going after one another. So there was some kind of conflict of interest. This was the South back then. This was America. The trial is a testament. It's an example of misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, a lot of misconduct that went on. In fact, it was said that the prosecutor, Hugh Dorsey, paid witnesses, planted, fabricated evidence, paid false witnesses, and so much went on. So these are the main cast of characters that I can think of right now. And I will now tell the story in a subsequent video. Um, so, yeah, who else do I want to mention? Yeah, so that was Tom Watson was a main character, and yeah, that's it. So I'm gonna do another video and just tell the story. My name's Oluro Timosha. I'll keep you posted.